Hi class, welcome to the week 6 online presentation. This week's objectives are: first, we're going to define how policies can be used on criminal justice. Then we're going to explain why we need criminal justice policies. We're going to describe how criminal justice policies develop. Then we're going to analyze how politics impact criminal justice policies. And lastly, we're going to explain the importance of research in criminal justice policies. So to begin with, let's look over what a policy is. So here's a textbook definition of a policy. It's going to be a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by a government, party, business, or individual. So think of it as this course of action or this principle as a rule that the government might take or an individual business. So this is going to be both in private and public practice. So those of you that work in the criminal justice sector, for example, law enforcement, I know some of you are police officers, corrections officers, think of certain policies or rules or regulations that you have to follow when you're dealing, for example, with an inmate or when you're pulling somebody over. Now, those of you that have jobs in the private sector, think of certain policies that your job might have you follow, even something as simple as clocking out for lunch because you may not be a salaried employee, for example, or certain policies you have to follow when using certain language or certain behaviors with your coworkers, for example. And this is usually given to you or you're trained in it when you're first hired, for example. You might have workshops to remind you of these things. Um, so um, policies, it's what's going to be used to provide guidance to individuals, again, in the criminal justice sector and outside of the criminal justice field, right? Like there's certain policies that health professionals have to follow when they're dealing with a patient. There's certain policies, I'm sure, that accountants have to follow when filing someone's taxes, when giving in that service. So just like an accountant, just like a medical professional, just like a first responder has to follow certain policies, um, individuals that are involved in the criminal justice system also have certain policies they have to follow. Now, policies are going to vary by state, sometimes by county within states, or even by individual cities within counties. And state policies and regulations, etc., are going to be might be different than they will be at the federal level, which is the national level. So just to give you a quick example, think about marijuana laws. It's policy that in some states it's used for recreational purposes. In other states, it could only be used for medicinal purposes, or in other states, it's completely outlawed. Now, an example given to us by Malaco is that policy will um, allow judges to make sentencing decisions. So, for example, a defendant um, might have been proven guilty in their trial, right? Or, yeah, let's say they were proven guilty in their trial, right? And now, based on that specific crime that the individual, the defendant, is guilty for, now the judge has some guidelines, right? Uh, that will tell the judge specifically um, what that individual sentence should be, right? So that way, it does take away discretion from the judge, but it's a policy that will try to make it as fair as possible or as equitable as possible for all defendants in front of that judge. This is also going to facilitate and regulate any of the actions that everybody in the criminal justice system takes. So if there is for example, department-wide policy, it's going to hopefully ensure that all police officers are engaging within the same policy that's standardized. That way they follow the directions, rules, or regulations when dealing with members of the public. And that way no rules are broken, for example. Now, again, policies, this is what's most important here at the bottom of the slide, that policies serve as the rules that workers in the criminal justice system use to do their jobs. And again, this applies for everyone, okay? Just like, your professor might have certain policies about following the syllabus, or your teachers when you went to high school, right? That if you were absent, the policy is, well, they have to allow you to make up the work, things of that nature, okay? So why do we need criminal justice policies? Well, we need policies related to everything. But regarding criminal justice, um, oftentimes we as a society see that there's problems that need to be addressed. And for example, it could be the presence of crime or handling of certain offenders. And we'll, as a society, will pass policies so that we could take care of those problems. Now, usually it's going to be the federal government that's going to create the crime control policies. And there has been a high level of policy implementation that's related to criminal justice issues. And this has led individuals to believe that the crime rate um, has spiked. But that's something that we'll discuss a little bit later in this presentation. Now, if at any point in time you want to take notes on this and I'm going too fast, just feel free to pause the slide. So again, we need policies just to take care of things that individuals deem that might be as a problem. So I'll give you an example. I believe it was 2008, there was a shooting, the Marjory Stoneman Douglas at high school. I think it's in Broward County. So individuals within the community in the state of Florida deemed that, school shootings is a problem. So a policy that was adopted after that, I don't remember the name of the policy right away off the top of my head, but it was that every single school now needs to have um, a guardian. So this could be a school resource officer or a police officer. I know that one of the students in this class is a police officer from one of the school districts down here in South Florida. So that officer or this student may know off the top of their head the name of this act, but this is a policy that was passed, for example, because of a problem that we saw as a community, right? School shootings, mass shootings, etc. So now we have someone to protect every single school. And again, here's an example, right? Another example, overcrowding of prisons. So we need to pass something now or develop some type of policy so that prisons are not overcrowding. And this is when you see ideas of releasing nonviolent offenders or um, expunging, you know, crimes that are again nonviolent or minor drug use crimes, which we'll discuss a little bit later again in this presentation. So, how is a policy going to develop? And this is not only criminal justice policy, but this is policies in general. So, um, as you see here, it is a six-step process. All right. So first, we're going to have the identification of the problem. What is the problem? Um, Based on that problem, what's going to be the demands of the policy that we're going to create? Then we're going to come up with an agenda. We're going to form an agenda to see how we tackle this problem, how the policy is going to be made to tackle the problem. Then we're going to adopt the policy, actually put it in place, right? We're going to vote on it, figure it out, and then the fifth one's going to be that we're going to implement it. We're going to execute it. Then lastly, we're going to evaluate it. And the evaluation number 6 is very important because if we evaluate the policy and we see that it's not working, is it worth it for the taxpayers and the stakeholders to continue engaging in that policy? Probably not, right? We want to make sure that everything based off that policy is positive or that the positive outweighs the negative, right? So sometimes there's unintended consequences that we have to evaluate. So for starters, for planning a policy, right, issues can be identified by anybody, by a concerned citizen, by the media, or even by an advocacy group, as well as politicians. And this is why we have advocacy groups here in the picture, or different non-governmental organizations that might bring to light some of the problems that we might have. So some of these problems could be things like crime rates that may be rising in certain areas, things regarding sexual offenders and the residency requirements within the community. So there could be significant debate about the demands of the policy, right? So, for example, what are the goals? Is it to help individuals? Is it to rehabilitate them? Or does the society want retribution? Do we want to help these individuals so they're productive members of society, or do we want them to be behind bars first, right? So this is where debate takes place. So this is when the individuals that are going to pass the policy have to figure out, what is the intent of this policy that we're putting forward, for example. And then with the agenda formation process, right, this is what's called the most politicized stage, because this is going to involve the government officials and the interest groups. And this is when we might have the interest groups working hand in hand with the government officials, or we might see interest groups lobbying or giving campaign donations for government officials in order to pass certain policies. Now, for the adopting and implementing phase, the the policy can usually become a law in one of two ways, right? So the law will be will be written by Congress, right? Both chambers, and I'm discussing at the federal or even at the state level. Um, the Senate or the House of Representatives will write a bill, right? They'll negotiate on the bill. They might send it back and forth to each other to make sure that the language is something that they both agree with. And then once they agree with that bill, they will send it over to the executive. This is why we have a picture here of our current president, Donald Trump. Um, not sure he's in the picture signing a law into action, but when Congress does passes a law, excuse me, the president will be the one to sign it. Or if it's a state law, a policy passed at the state level, the governor will be the one to sign it, right? So usually that's the case. When a law or policy is passed, it's going to be by the lawmakers, by the Congress. But there's also something that the governor or the president can do, and that is pass an executive order, which is bypassing Congress and making a law themselves, which is not as common. Now, the implementation phase is going to be related, to how that specific policy is being executed and how it's carried out. So for starters is the money, is the funding, right? So going back to that example I gave about hiring school resource officers or more police officers, one thing that school districts or counties or the state have to figure out is where are we going to get the money for if we don't have enough police officers? So do we raise taxes? Do we use the taxes for the property taxes that individuals are paying for the school districts? Do we ask the state for money? Do we ask the federal government for a grant? So one thing is always going to be, well, one very important thing is always going to be the funding for that project. Then there's going to be challenges, right? Sometimes the law can be too vague, and sometimes the law can not only be too vague, but the language of that law may have had the individuals that were voting for it think that the law was supposed to do something else, but the language is confusing. Then we have the situation in which we were discussing earlier about funding. If there's not enough funding, it might be a great idea on paper, but if it's too expensive or not, or if it's something that lawmakers don't set as a top priority, they might not give enough funding for it, and then the policy cannot be carried out. Another thing that can happen is that the actual policy can be challenged, right? There could be individuals that are against the policy, which could stall or altogether stop the policy from being implemented by an interest group or a concerned citizen. Now, lastly is the evaluation of the policy. So the evaluation stage looks at how efficient a policy is, and during this stage, there's going to be certain questions that are going to be asked, and these questions are going to be things like, did the policy accomplish what it set out to do? What impact does the policy have? So policy evaluation could be divided into two general categories. And the first one is process evaluation, which is going to involve looking at the progression of the policy development experience. And it's going to see if there are areas where these methods could be improved or streamlined. Now, if the implementation of the policy differs from the original intent, whether it's positively or negatively, questions like how can this be resolved might be asked. Now, on the other hand, we have outcome evaluation, which looks at the changes that occur as a result of the policy. So, for example, does the implementation of early intervention programming in elementary school reduce the number of youth who are adjudicated delinquent in juvenile court, right? So we want this intervention to have obviously a positive effect. So what I have here on the right is an example of outcome evaluation of a program. So some of you may have already had these professors in some of your classes. Dr. Stosenberg, Dr. DeLacy, or Dr. Flexen. If you come back to get your master's here, you will most certainly have Dr. DeLacy or Dr. Flexen. Dr. Stolzenberg is the chair of the department. But they did a study on um, body-worn cameras in Miami-Dade County, and they wanted to see if body-worn cameras had any significant effect as far as did it reduce the amount of um, complaints against police officers. And from my understanding, it did. So um, here in their research and their outcome evaluation, they could evaluate whether, hey, did the Miami-Dade County Police Department, did this affect the way that their police officers are, one, seen by the public, two, the way they're interacting with the public, and was the taxpayer money that's being used for this program of wearing body-worn cameras, is it justified to the taxpayer with the results that we have? Okay, so evaluation is very important to see if you continue this program. You don't want to continue a program that is has negative results and is using a lot of the taxpayer money that could be used for something else. Now, who can develop criminal justice policy or policy in general? So we have political figures like congressional members of a state government or a member of the actual U.S. Congress can sponsor a bill that affects the criminal justice system. Now, typically what's going to happen is that members of congressional members, whether it's at the state or federal level, are going to debate the bill, and here's when we'll decide if the members will vote for it or against it. And if it does pass, then it will be sent over to the President of the United States if it's at the federal level, right? So in this case, on the bottom right, we have 3 representatives from South Florida, and let's say that they vote to pass a certain bill. Remember, a bill is it's not a law yet. Okay, it's a bill is what the excuse me, the bills what the representatives or the senators are working on as they create the law. Okay, so it's a proposed law. Okay, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So a bill is a proposed law, and as they're proposing that law, once they pass it in both the Senate and the House, they will send it to the president. So in this case, these 3 individuals, they're representatives from South Florida. Let's say they pass the bill, they'll send it to the president, in this case, Donald Trump. Now, we have up here our Governor Ron DeSantis. If it's a policy at the state level, it would be in Tallahassee. They would be doing the same thing, and then they send it for him. They send it to him for him to sign it. Okay. Now, they are not the only ones that could develop criminal justice policy, right? Sometimes the creation of new policies are passed to amend existing regulations. Okay, so keep that in mind. So aside from lawmakers and the executive branches of states and the federal government, we have what's called direct democracy, and this is when individuals, all of you and myself, can actually be the ones to be voting for the laws. So this is a process in which citizens are empowered to make law through an initiative process, and there's 17 states that allow you to do it this way. And the initiative process begins with a petition for a new law. So there's a petition, enough people sign it, right? If there is a minimum number of signatures from registered voters on that petition, then the measure is placed on the ballot for individuals in that state to vote. And then there's been cases like in California, if a measure receives a majority of the votes, it's going to be enacted into law. Now, there's something that makes this process of direct democracy unique because it's going to bypass the traditional structure of lawmaking, which is having these individuals pass the laws. And it's not going to really require the support of these individuals because we as a citizenry, we could be the one to get the laws passed. So Malaco gives an example of the 3 strikes laws passed in California in 1994 and the Jessica's Law, which created regulations for sex offenders. I put here on the right side laws that were passed in Florida. So for example, Florida Amendment 4 which was in the last midterm election, 2018, the citizens of Florida themselves voted for ex-convicts to be able to have their voting rights restored, with the exception of individuals that were convicted of a homicide or of a sexual crime. So in this case, politicians in Florida weren't addressing this, or not enough politicians were addressing this issue. So regular people like you and myself went out to the street, collected enough signatures, put it on the ballot, and enough people voted for it to vote to have individuals who are ex-convicts have their voting rights restored. Something else, which was Amendment 2, which this was in the 2016 election, was to allow a medical use of marijuana for individuals with certain diseases, right? So again, the legislature in Florida and Tallahassee was not getting this passed, so the people collected enough signatures and we voted for it together, and it passed. So what are the goals of criminal justice policies? Now, before I get into the goals, I'm actually going to pause here and end this for part 1.